We're also not going to cancel Michael F. Florio's starts and sits here for Week 10 as we start customarily with the quarterbacks. That continues today. Which quarterback, perhaps a young signal caller, are we putting in our lineup, Mike?
For decades, I was traumatized by a New England quarterback as a Bills fan, but now I am supporting one. I am firmly in on Drake May right now for fantasy purposes. In 3 full starts, he is averaging just under 19 fantasy points per game. You see there, 95 rushing yards. That is a running back number in his 4 starts this year, not including the game that he did not finish. 49 rushing yards per game, which elevates his floor and his ceiling so much. I know the Bears are a tough defense, but so were the Titans, so were the Texans, so were the Jets. He ran on all 3 of them. I think what he gives you with his legs and with them being in comeback mode, having to throw a lot, makes him someone you could start in fantasy. He reminds me a whole lot of Josh Allen. I also think you could start the quarterback that plays right next door to us, Matthew Stafford. 6 passing touchdowns in his last 2 games after just 3 in his first 6, averaging just under 290 passing yards per game in the 2 games with Kupp and Puka back. And we saw this story last season. It was a slow start for Matthew Stafford, but once the Rams offense got healthy, he went off and was a QB1. Now he gets the Dolphins, who've allowed 22-plus fantasy points in 2 straight games, and they have the offense to make this a high-scoring competitive game.
All right, so the folks in Orchard Park watching, folks all over upstate New York, heard you say Drake May, Josh Allen. They're asking for a clarification, Mike.
He reminds me of him. Josh Allen is way better, but there's flashes that I'm like, oh, this reminds me of rookie year Josh.
See, there you go. So that's why we have Michael F. Florio here, because he can clarify. Let's clarify who we're putting on the bench.
I said to sit C.J. Stroud last week, and I think you could just continue to sit him right now. I know Nico Collins might be back, and that is huge, but C.J. Stroud in his last 3 games has had fewer than 13 fantasy points in each. He has 1 passing touchdown in those 3 games. He has just 3 games this season with more than 1 passing touchdown, but this is more about the matchup. The Lions have allowed the 2nd fewest passing touchdowns in the NFL. They have nearly twice as many interceptions as passing touchdowns allowed, and they've allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game in the last month. They have not allowed a QB1 since week 4. I know he is a big name. Getting Nico Collins back helps, but right now I think you can take a wait-and-see approach and play it safe, go in a different direction.
Yeah, it's been an absolute struggle on offense for the Texans, especially protecting C.J. Stroud. The run game helps. Let's get to the run game ourselves. Who are we starting at running back?
Thursday night. King Henry is not the only running back you could start in that one. I think Chase Brown is very much so in play. He's been averaging just under 17 fantasy points per game since week 4. I know the Ravens are really tough against the run, but Chase Brown was the first running back to have an explosive run against them when they played in the first time. He had multiple, in fact. He went for 16 fantasy points in that game. And the Ravens, as good as they are against the run, they have one big weakness. It's running backs that could catch passes. They've allowed the 4th most receiving yards and touchdowns to running backs. So I think the explosive Chase Brown remains in play. And then you're going to wake up real early to watch Giants-Panthers. Why not get in a little bit of the fantasy fun? I think Tyrone Tracy Jr. is a must start this week. He has taken over that Giants backfield. You see there's 17-plus touches in 4 of the last 5 games. He has 23 and 17 opportunities in his last 2 games. The Panthers have allowed the most rushing yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points per game to running backs. This is a trend that goes all the way back to last season as well. And if the Giants have a lead, which is possible in this one, Tracy should be heavily used in the second half to grind out the clock. So get him in all your lineups this week.
Not glad we agree on Tyrone Tracy. Which running back is going to the bench this week?
I'm just going to do what I did last week, and I'm going to say avoid the Bucs backfield in this one. Irving led them in carries last week while Rachaad White led in snaps played. He got the touchdown. They split pass game work pretty much right down the middle. And then it is a really tough matchup. The 49ers have allowed the 5th fewest rushing yards to backs this season, explosive runs at the lowest rate in the NFL. They've allowed just 1 top 10 running back since week 4. If you have to pick between the 2, I'll go White because of the pass game usage, but ideally, I think they eat too much off of one another's plate, so I would try to stay away if possible.
Yeah, a tough situation. Again, maybe you're doing the run-pass split thing with their matchup, trying to figure out which Bucs back to use, because with 3, sometimes it's hard to find just one. It's hard to find sleepers in general. Let's go to Marcus Grant for Week 10 sleepers.
I'm going to do my best here, Patrick, as I talk to you some sleepers at the quarterback and running back position. Let's start in Minnesota, where Sam Darnold got off to a very quick start this season, then had a little bit of a lull about the midway point of the first half of the season. You know what I'm talking about. Now he's starting to bounce back a little bit. Scored 19 points last week against the Indianapolis Colts. That was despite 3 turnovers in the ballgame. He holds on to the ball. He's actually a top 3 quarterback in week 9. Now he gets the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have been just as, if not more generous to fantasy quarterbacks. 19 touchdown passes allowed, just 2 interceptions. 6 quarterbacks have multiple touchdown passes against the Jags, 5 with more than 250 passing yards. This feels like a spot for Sam Darnold to stay hot. Staying in the NFC North, going over to Chicago, where I like DeAndre Swift this week. The offense has been struggling a little bit lately. Maybe it's time for Shane Waldron and the Bears to hashtag establish it. If they are going to do that, New England is a nice place to do it against. The Patriots have a run defense ranked 27th, 7 games with 110 or more rushing yards allowed. 7 different players have run for at least 80 yards against New England this season. Swift pretty much dominating the backfield opportunities, 65% of the snaps, 56% of the rushing attempts. And a deep sleeper, I guess, at quarterback. We're going to go back to Mr. Dimes because we want to watch this brutal, angry, get out of my way, run from Daniel Jones. Here's the thing with Daniel Jones this year. Either he's going to throw you 2 touchdown passes in a game or none. Those have been the only outcomes for him in terms of throwing the football this year. But he is 7th in rushing yards amongst quarterbacks, going against a Carolina defense that ranks 28th against the pass with 18 touchdown passes and 3 interceptions so far this season.
Make some noise for wide receivers and tight ends. And Michael F. Florio starts and sits. Go to NFL.com/start-sit to read the entire column. We get snippets here on NFL Fantasy Live, but we appreciate all of them. Let's start with these wide receivers. Again, 4 teams on bye, Mike. We need to get guys in spots.
There is one constant with the Colts this year in a year of turmoil. Other than making bad quarterback decisions, it is Josh Downs, who has 9 targets in 2 straight games and 5 of his last 6. He has averaged 15.5 fantasy points per game in that 6-game stretch. It has not mattered who has been throwing him the ball, Anthony Richardson or Joe Flacco. Now he gets the Bills, who have allowed the 6th most yards to slot receivers, 2nd most since week 5, and Downs runs over 60% of his routes from the slot. So in a game where the Colts could be in catch-up mode, Josh Downs is a must-start.
All right, let's go over to a sit. Who are we putting on our bench this week when we really need wideout help?
Big name. The wide receiver that has come with the most expectation in years, Marvin Harrison Jr. You see there, 1 top 50 finish in his last 5 games, 5.5 targets in his last 6, fewer than 6 fantasy points in 5 of those 6 games. But it's also about the matchup. Harrison runs about 80% of his routes out wide, so he will see plenty of Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed. The Jets as a whole allowed the fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers and 1 top 12 since week 3. I also think you could sit Jalen Waddle this week. He has not topped 50 yards or double-digit fantasy points since week 1. 2 targets in 2 of his last 3 games, and last week, his first catch came with under 3 minutes left in the 4th quarter. And the Rams, they have been tougher on wide receivers ever since they sat Trey White. 1 top 10 wide receiver in their last 6 games. Waddle is far from a must-start. He, in fact, player I think you should just get away from right now.
Yeah, that first catch in the 4th quarter was actually his first target as well. It was a missing Jalen Waddle, who didn't even waddle after his touchdown. His teammates were trying to get him.
He was too upset.
He was like, I'm out here playing this football game. Fortunately, it wasn't the cardio king. Let's go to the tight ends. Who are we getting in our lineup?
Last week I said to sit TJ Hawkinson. I think, though, we saw him for a game. Now you go and you get him back into your lineup. 45% of the snaps and 4 targets last week, but the hope is that his usage will increase each week, and this is such a good matchup. The Jaguars, 5th most fantasy points per game to tight ends in the last month. 3 of the 4 who played them in that span scored at least 16. Given the upside in the matchup and 4 teams on bye, I think it is fine to get him back in your starting lineup. And I talked about a Colt earlier. I have to talk about a Bill. It's in my contract. 10 targets the last 2 weeks for Dalton Kincaid, at least 6 in 6 straight games. He is heavily used against zone coverage, though, which is so important because the Colts, they use zone coverage at the 2nd highest rate in the NFL. They've also allowed the 6th most yards and 3rd most fantasy points to tight ends. So just keep riding with the Bills tight end right now.
All right, going with the Bills tight end. Which tight end is going on our bench here in Week 10?
the tight end that was drafted first in almost all fantasy leagues this year, Sam Laporta. I am sorry, we have just reached this point. 3.3 targets per game. Listen to this. Without Jameson Williams, 27% target rate, 24% first read share per fantasy points data. Without Williams, that drops from a 27% target rate to 12% and from a 24% first read share to 8%. So the usage is just not there when Williams is on the field. Plus, Texans are the toughest matchup by far for tight ends. So I think you get away from the number 1 tight end drafted.
Yeah, a rough situation for Sam Laporta managers all season long. Sam and his team's doing pretty well.
Yeah.
Let's go over and get some sleepers with Marcus Grant.
Let's do it as we talk about some pass-catching sleepers here in Week 10. And we're talking a lot about the 49ers. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey is back, but against the Buccaneers, we really like their passing game. I talked about Purdy and George Kittle. Let's give Juwan Jennings some love as well. Remember he had that huge blow-up game against the Rams when he looked like the second coming of Jerry Rice? The thing about Juwan Jennings this week, 54% of his routes have come from the slot. No team has allowed more receiving yards to slot targets than the Buccaneers. The other part of it is the Niners are already seeing a lot of loaded boxes, which is giving these receivers room to run. Now that Christian McCaffrey is back, do the Bucs sell out even more to try and stop the ground game, which potentially opens some things up for Jennings down the field? Then earlier in the show, you heard us talking about Mike Gesicki. Here's where I sort of admit that for me, Mike Gesicki used to be shorthand for those tight ends and just seemed to be kind of underwhelming, but just hang around on your roster. But to Gesicki's credit, he has made it, taken advantage of some good opportunities. The last 2 weeks, 14 targets, 12 catches for $173 and 2 touchdowns. With T. Higgins banged up and looking questionable for this week, more opportunities for Gesicki against a Baltimore defense that has given up 5 top 12 weekly finishes against tight ends this season. And for a deep sleeper, we're going to go down to Duval and get you Parker Washington. He's taken over the intermediate routes vacated by Christian Kirk, who's now on injured reserve. Washington has back-to-back games with 3 catches, 40 or more yards. He's the second guy, and he's second in targets, rather, on the team over the last 2 weeks. Going against a Vikings defense that, yes, while it gets praised for being good, it's also the most favorable matchup for fantasy wide receivers this season. Second most yards allowed on those medium depth throws between 10 and 19 yards down the field. So the volume might not be great. Washington has a chance to kind of put together a nice number for anybody looking for a flex option this week.